So bring on the endless swarms and hulking broods of monstrous creatures. The new Codex Tyranids is here, and it perhaps looks more in-depth and scary than any previous version of the book. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're doing a full review of the match play rules for Codex Tyranids. I'm sure plenty of you are well aware already, but it seems that someone has leaked what appears to be the entire final copy of the book to the internet, a version that feels very similar to the playtested version of the Eldari Codex, and all the datasheets that I saw from that mirrored what was finally released exactly. For that reason, I'm pretty sure that this will be exactly what is present in Codex Tyranids when it goes into print. Of course though, if we do learn any differently, I'll certainly make another video to address any changes on the channel, though I really do suspect that any changes will be very minor indeed. So Codex Tyranids, like just about any other 9th edition codex, is very dense indeed. Like normal, I'll be focusing on the match play rules here, though there'll be extensive sections on lore, miniature galleries, and the crusade rules for the Tyranids. It'll be the main rules on how the army works that I'm going to be focusing on today. We've got plenty of the core rules for the codex, synapse, shadow in the warp, plenty of other special rules that make their detachments work, a new army-wide special rule called Synaptic Imperatives, which appears to be the pure Tyranids rule. It basically gives them a turn-by-turn buff that's broadcast through their synapse creatures, depending on what creatures that you have on the table, and it feels all very fluffy like you're enacting the will of the hive mind. The Hive Fleet rules have been vastly reimagined, much better than they were before, and there's an interesting new biomorphologies rule where you get to swap out one of the traits of Hive Fleets for something else if you like to, maybe giving you a bit of a sense that you're adapting to enemies on the fly. A couple of big pages of stratagems. The adaptive physiologies for monster upgrades are now paid for in points, some of them are good. There's 3 secondary objectives, plenty of character upgrades, 6 Warlord Traits, 12 Relics, and 6 powers from the Hive Mind discipline. The Hive Fleet psychic powers are very much still in existence as well. And then of course there's the many reimagined datasheets. There's a couple of new ones, including the Parasite of Mortrex, and individual ones for the Winged Hive Tyrant, which is now separate from the standard one. It appears that the Red Terror has disappeared, that's no longer in the Codex, and a massive amount of stat line improvements and weapon changes. In particular for the monsters and the heavy infantry, they really seem to have gone very heavy on the stat line buffs, almost everything gaining more strength, toughness, wounds and attacks. Finally, synaptic link rules are often still present in Spirit. Some of them have been slightly shifted to synaptic imperatives, though most of the HQs have a command phase ability that they can broadcast through the synaptic link, giving out minor buffs to the swarms. Really quite a lot to get your teeth into here. So let's start out by going over the common army rules then. First up, as expected, there's one called Rare Organisms, no more than 1 Hive Tyrant per detachment, very similar to quite a lot of the other armies like Space Marine Captains. Troops gain objective secured, though there are a few changes in the slot. Gargoyles are troops now, Rippers and Genestealers are not, so that is going to alter which units do get OBSEC. OBSEC Gargoyles moving 12 inches though really is quite powerful. Next up, as I mentioned, Hive Fleet adaptations do have a funny way that they work. You get a primary trait, similar to a chapter tactic for Space Marines. Then if every model is in the same Hive Fleet, then you can swap out the second part of your Hive Fleet trait for a Hyper-Adaptation, some different abilities from some tables of traits to better tailor to your opponent's army as you get to select it at the start of a game. We'll go through those in more detail when we get to the Hive Fleets. There's a special rule called spore seeding for living artillery, which are essentially the spore mines and mucilid spores, basically saying that they don't gain any Hive Fleet adaptations, they don't break any detachment rules, and they have a whole ton of rules on their datasheets. They can't do actions, can't screen enemy models from moving through them, can't screen enemy models coming in from reserve, ignore morale, can't charge, and you can't use them for lookout sir. Basically spore mines and mucilids just aren't going to be doing a lot besides exploding all over the enemy from time to time. Synapse creatures are important to your army for a bunch of reasons, though in general instinctive behaviour isn't going to be one of them anymore, as it appears that it's absolutely gone from the Codex. Previously you'd be getting -1 to hit or -2 to charge if you weren't in Synapse range. That no longer appears to be the case. Synapse now only appears to be a rule that gives you auto-passing morale for units within 6 inches. Overall it's probably a buff, although I think it removes a little bit of flavour. The morale thing is still going to be very important, as a lot of the non-synapse creatures have very low leadership indeed, and to be honest you're still going to want to keep your synapse creatures alive. They're big important characters, and they can provide further buffs from synaptic imperatives or their synaptic link command abilities. Shadow in the Warp has seen a minor buff. This one's usually present on synapse units, and it means that psykers within 18 inches are -1 to cast, makes their spells a bit less reliable. But now also, if the enemy army has a perils result, then they take an extra mortal wound on top of the d3 that they'd normally take. Not going to come up all that often, but when it does, it'll be quite nasty. There really is quite a steep price to pay for messing up your psychic when you're within the Hive Fleet's range now. Swarming Masses is on a few datasheets like the Termagants, Hormagaunts, and the Gargoyles. This one's an extra special rule that allows you to fight within 2.5 inches of enemy models, not just in engagement range, and it also prevents certain rules that stop your units from fighting from basically having any effect at all. I must admit, it does seem like a bit of an awkwardly phrased one. The 2.5 inches thing maybe could allow a few of your bugs to randomly fight when your opponent's not even in engagement range, which is a bit weird. Or potentially it could help out with a few niche scenarios around the edges of your unit when you're fighting, maybe getting a few more models in combat. Seems a bit of a strange one though. Kind of funny to go out of your way to make a rather specific rule and it not really have a massive amount of effect on the target units. Synaptic links are still a common thread throughout the army. We were first introduced these in Psychic Awakening, and that's basically the idea that synapse creatures within 12 inches of each other can broadcast a lot of buffs to units that aren't anywhere near them. Say in this diagram there's a Brood Lord and a Hive Tyrant within 12 inches of each other. It means that the Gene Stealers in green are still within synaptic link range of the Brood Lord, even if they're really quite a long way away. A fair few abilities work through synaptic link range. Most of the psychic powers can be fired through multiple synaptic links, a lot of datasheet command abilities, and a few things like Warlord Traits and Relics as well. I think the Codex really does reward you for chaining together a whole load of synapse creatures to keep a hold over your lesser minions, and that does seem something that's really quite fluffy for Tyranids. Finally, last but not least, for the army-wide rules, we have Synaptic Imperatives, which I thought was powerful and interesting enough that it needed a slide all of its own. So Synaptic Imperatives appears to be the major Tyranid army-wide special rule. You get it if every single unit in your army has Hive Tendril as a keyword, a new keyword that basically is for every single unit in this book, and it differentiates Codex Tyranids from things like Genestealer cults who also have the Tyranids keyword but aren't actually from Codex Tyranids. For these Synaptic Imperatives, each synapse creature essentially has one different buff that it offers, and at the start of each battle round, you take a look at which creatures you have on the board, you select one of them to use their buff, and that buff is basically broadcast through every single synaptic creature in your army. They all gain a kind of mini aura ability, and it affects every single Tyranid unit in your army within that 6-inch range. There's no restriction on it being for core units or anything like that. Once you've used each synaptic imperative, you can't go back and use it again, so you might cycle through a few of your best ones in the first few turns, and then be left with some fairly underwhelming ones later on if you do have some good synaptic creatures surviving. I quite like it, as it really means that you've got incentive to protect your key synapse creatures, as if you lose an important one too early, it could maybe deny you a key buff. There is a stratagem that you can use to try and help with that though. Going through each of the imperatives on offer, as I mentioned, these buffs all go within 6 inches of every synapse creature on the board and aren't locked to core units. The Hive Tyrant gives you Relentless Ferocity, that lets you fall back and charge. Not the most helpful most of the time, but could be okay late game perhaps. The Brood Lord gives you Predatory Guile, infantry units within range gets light cover and heavy cover if they already had it. Not bad to basically get a lot of your army in light cover, though of course it doesn't affect monsters, and I do kind of wonder if they meant to write dense cover instead of heavy cover, as that would seem a bit more normal to me. The Tyranid Prime has a really good one called Guide Mind. This one's a massive shooting buff. All the units in range get exploding sixes to hit when shooting at a target within 24 inches. Usually that's going to be a nice 25% increase in damage, potentially even more than that if you're only hitting on 4s. It feels like that really ups the value of including a Tyranid Prime in your army just to be able to access that massive turn of shooting. The Turvigon gives you Surging Vitality, plus 2-inch movement when you make a normal move or advance. It's not nothing, but it's not excessive either. Occasionally might make a difference to get you to an objective or make a key charge. Psychic Augmentation is the Neurothrope one. That one gives you +1 to psychic tests, +1 to deny the witch, and a 5+ save against mortal wounds. Could be a really nice one to pull out of the bag against heavy psychic armors. Get a turn of heavy advantage over Grey Knights or Thousand Sons perhaps. Thrashing Demise is the Trigon Prime one, now an HQ slot. This one I'm a bit underwhelmed by, a +3 to the roll on death throws, and other models slain in melee will deal out a mortal wound on a roll of a 6. I just don't feel that that's usually going to amount to very much unless you're having massive amounts of your army wiped out. Goaded to Slaughter is another great one, and that's the Tyranid Warriors. Kind of similar to the Tyranid Prime, 6s in melee score an additional hit. If you've got a lot of scary bugs in melee, that one seems great to try and coordinate with a turn of melee carnage. Psychic Oversight is the Maleceptors one. That one allows your units to do actions while shooting, actions while advancing, falling back, or casting powers. Could be handy enough to raise some banners or something. Warp Shielding is the Zoanthrope one, and it does sound kind of insane to me, to be honest. Basically a turn of kind of army-wide invuls, monsters get a 4+ invul save, really nice on anything that has a 3+ save and no invul, and everything else in the army gets a 5+ invul save. That's going to make even things like Termagants and Hormagaunts really annoying to shift. I feel like Zoanthropes are going to be a lot more tempting to include, just because of that alone. Finally, Swift Onslaught is from the Parasite of Mortrex. That gives you a +3 inches to pile in and consolidate. Kind of handy, but a bit underwhelming compared with some of the big hitters maybe. I think maybe just some of the most obvious ones to use are Warp Shielding and the Exploding Sixes to hit at range and melee. All of those just translate into massive more defense or offense for your army, so are kind of hard to go wrong with. A lot of the others do seem really handy though. Next up, let's go into character upgrades and we'll look at Warlord Traits. These I think are so much better than the previous version of Codex Tyranids, which I found kind of underwhelming. Alien Cunning is an interesting one for your Warlord to actually do objectives themselves. It gives them objectives secured, counts as 5 models, and weirdly enough it can also do actions even if they advanced or fell back. I guess having objectives secured isn't the worst thing, particularly if you're a really tanky monstrous creature. Maybe it could be nice on something like a Turvigon perhaps. It does replace the redeploy the Warlord ability that it was before, which I did think was one of the better ones. Otherwise, Heightened Senses allows you to reroll all hit rolls, both at range and in melee. Not bad for a mixed threat Hive Tyrant maybe, and you also get to fight first in combat in ongoing melees. Synaptic Linchpin gives you a +3 inches to your aura abilities, Synaptic Imperatives, and Command Phase abilities. That one maybe feels a little bit less vital in Codex Tyranids, where hopefully you might have enough Synapse units to broadcast buffs all over the board anyway. Direct Guidance I think is going to be really popular. This one's a command phase ability to buff one core unit within synaptic link range, so again could be chained through other organisms, and it basically gives that core unit +1 to hit. I think if you're buying in Warlord Traits for one command point, that one's almost auto-include. You just need a decent core target to buff with it. Synaptic Tendrils allows you to use your datasheet command ability a second time. We'll go through those in the datasheet section. There's things like rerolling 1s to hit for Hive Tyrant, 1s to wound for primes, or +1 to hit for termagants for the Turvigon. Again, seems a really easy pickup, maybe a little bit inferior to direct guidance I think on most buffing units. And then finally we have Adaptive Biology, a nice 5+ feel no pain. Again, super good value, that's just going to add up to your monstrous creature being around about 50% tougher. Really quite nice to see that there's a fair few tempting picks now. I think my favourite are the Feel No Pain, the Direct Guidance for +1 to hit, and maybe the Objective Secured one. That could be really annoying on something very tough. Next up, let's take a look through the Relics. Again, another section that seems some serious improvements. The Imgar factor gives you a buff at the start of each fight phase, either +2 strength, +1 attack, or +1 toughness. Theoretically, that could make a lot of your really big monsters toughness 9, which is quite funny. The other bits could be really handy as well though, if you just want more damage. The Reaper of Obliterax is a bone sword. Every successful wound roll gives you 1 extra mortal wound, and the enemy can't make use of any rules to ignore wounds, things like Feel No Pain type saves, or Catan damage limitations to stop your damage going through. With 5 attacks per Hive Tyrant, that could easily add up to a fair few mortal wounds. Could also be very handy with tangling with some bigger hitters who have those kind of defences. The Maw-Claw of Thyrax appears to be takeable on anyone. It gives you +1 attack, and also allows you to reroll wound rolls in melee. Perhaps really nice for some lower strength weapons, maybe the monstrous Scything Talons. Also, as a nice little extra, if you kill an enemy unit, you gain 1 extra attack for the rest of the game, to a maximum of 3 extra. As an all-round combat buff, that one seems fine, probably better than the Imgar factor. The Resonance Barb has been nerfed a bit. It gives you +1 to psychic tests, and the bearer knows 1 extra power, but it doesn't allow you to cast 1 more anymore. Not terrible for a key psyker I guess though still. Pathogenesis is a buff to your ranged weapons. It gives you an extra 8 inches to your weapon range, and reroll 1 hit roll and wound roll when you're shooting. Seems a little bit underwhelming maybe. I guess perhaps it could make itself useful on something like a heavy venom cannon. Those 3 shots would be very reliable to get some damage. The Scythes of Tyran are monstrous Scything Talons relics. They'd usually be strength 7, AP minus 3, damage 2. These ones go up to a whopping strength 9, AP minus 4, damage 3, and still get the standard plus 2 attacks. Generally that's just going to be an all-round melee bruiser of a tyrant. They do seem quite efficient. There's the Balethorn Cannon, a Relic Stranglethorn Cannon. Again, this one just seems a very generalist all-round damage dealer. D3 plus 3 shots, strength 10, AP minus 3, damage 3. Seems kind of similar to a lot of weapons carried by Imperial Knights. Shard Gullet is a Relic Heavy Venom Cannon, 36 inches and assault 3, strength 12, AP minus 5, damage 5. Potentially even better against heavies than the Balethorn Cannon, though I think I would have the Balethorn Cannon out of the two to be honest. It's just perhaps a bit more flexible and better against 3 wound infantry. There's a fun relic called the Gestation Sag. I feel like this could be really quite popular for a frontline character. Once per game you can do an action instead of shooting, and that action allows you to spawn D3 plus 1 Ripper Swarms, setting them up within 3 inches, not within engagement range, and they don't cost you any reinforcement points. That could be really quite handy just to dump an extra few models onto an objective and keep it safe, or potentially just generate some screening units to go off and nuisance charge some enemies, or just put a barrier between the enemy and your swarms for a turn. The Dirge Heart of Karis is a debuff when you hit the enemy in melee. They lose their Obsec rule for a turn and get -1 leadership. I guess potentially handy, I'm not sure to be a very high pick for me though. The Passenger is for an Adrenal Glands model. It gives you +2 to advance and charge. That could allow some very easy reserve charges, maybe from a Winged Hive Tyrant or a Trigon Prime. And finally, Seer Hive is for a model with Toxin Sacs. It allows you to auto-wound non-monsters and vehicles in melee. Again, that seems like it's one for a whole load of low-strength attacks, perhaps something like a Trigon Prime or Scything Talons. There's really quite a lot of juicy damage dealers here. Maybe some of the ones that stand out the most are the Reaper, the Scythes of Tyran for damage 3 and loads of attacks, that Balethorn Cannon which looks like it'll kill everything pretty well. I like the Spawning Ripper's ability, and +2 to charge seems really handy if you are going to be using your character in reserves. Next up we have the Psychic powers. The Hive 9 discipline has seen a few key changes, but there's a couple of really interesting traits through all of the spells. The buffing abilities aren't locked to any core units, so you can use them on the biggest critters around, and also all of them can be channeled through Synaptic Link range, so say you had a Neurothrope squatting at the back of your army, you could chain its buff through a midfield Broodlord and a Hive Tyrant, and then potentially give your buff or debuff to a unit that's really far away from it on the board. That seems very powerful. You could potentially be casting things well out of deny range. First up, Catalyst is Warp Charge 6, a 5+ Feel No Pain or 6+ for Titanic unit. That was great and remains great. That kind of durability boost is going to remain a staple. The Horror is Warp Charge 5, a Synaptic Link range or 24-inch debuff. -2 leadership and -1 combat attrition, relevant against some armies, really not against others, probably not going to get taken very much. The Neuroparasite is Warp Charge 7, a Synaptic Link range or 18 inches. This one's one that you'd want to use to target really low toughness enemies. You roll 1d6 per enemy model in the unit. Each roll that you roll higher than their toughness deals 1 mortal wound, up to a total maximum of 6. This one's really going to punish toughness 3 infantry, but is kind of underwhelming against most other things. Kind of a bit situational. Depends on how many toughness 3 models you think are going to be in the meta. Onslaught is still amazing. It's Warp Charge 6 and Synaptic Link range. Incidentally, Synaptic Link range is 12 inches or 12 inches to the next creature and within 12 inches of them. This one still allows you to advance and charge, and it also gives you no penalty for advancing and firing an assault weapon or moving and firing heavy weapons. Really pretty powerful that you can still advance and charge in the Codex. It adds a massive amount of threat range to the Tyranid melee. Paroxysm is Warp Charge 7 and Synaptic Link range out to 18 inches. This one means the enemy unit can't overwatch or set to defend, and also gives them a -1 to wound debuff in melee, which is really quite potent. It means that even say Space Marines will only be wounding your Gaunts on a 4+. This one really will take the wind out of a powerful enemy melee unit. I feel like that one's quite a nice one to have around. Finally, Psychic Scream is Warp Charge 5, again Synaptic Link range or 18 inches, D3 mortal wounds, and if the psychic test was higher than the leadership of an enemy psyker, then they also permanently forget one of their powers, determined randomly. Quite nice to be able to channel that damage through Synaptic Link again. That means you could really be striking at the exact unit that you need to hit most in the enemy army. I guess the psyker thing's kind of fun, but a bit unreliable. Overall, out of these, I still think that Catalyst and Onslaught are going to be the absolute staples. They're both still great. and if you've got a fair few powers going spare, Neuroparasite, Paroxysm and Psychic Scream all seem perfectly usable and nice to have around. Next up we have the Tyranid Stratagems. These have been changed up a bit. There were a fair few very powerful ones that are gone. You can no longer double shoot for 2 command points, or pay CP for vastly increased movement. I feel like a few of those did really feel like they were written in 8th edition before Games Workshop quite understood how powerful those mechanics could be. Still though, there's really quite a lot of good stuff. For 1 or 2 CP we have Scorch Bugs. This one's a Flesh Borer buff. Flesh Borers being Strength 5 AP-1 Damage 1 now. This one gives them an extra 6-inch range at 24 inches and plus 1 strength to 6. It seems pretty brutal on something like a massive unit of 30 termagants, and you can use it on the Flesh Borer Hive of the Tyrannifex. That one would cost 2 CP though, and again that's 30 shots. Seems okay for the damage boost if you do need it against a toughness 5 or 6 target. For 1 CP we have the Voracious Appetite. That one's unchanged I believe. Rerolling wound rolls in melee with a monster is very nice. Really nice for the more mid-strength things like Strength 7 monsters. They'll really thank you for that. Adrenal Surge is 1 or 2 command points. This one's for an adrenal glands unit that gives them plus 1 attack or plus D3 for monsters. 2 command points if there's 20 or more models in the unit, but seems like quite a powerful one for something like a big unit of Tyranid warriors. Getting an extra D3 attacks on a Hive Tyrant though also doesn't seem bad at all. For 1 or 2 command points we have Reinforced Hive Node. This one's for Tyranid warriors or Tyranid Prime. A nice reactive -1 damage stratagem, and it costs 2 CP if there's 6 or more models in the squad. Really nasty to be able to turn this one on at will. It means that say if your Tyranid warriors are targeted by damage 2 weapons or something, then you can cut all that damage output in half. For 1 command point we have Observer Organism. This one's an Exocrine buff. It gives you 6s to hit Explode so they get an extra hit, and they also get to ignore cover, though the Exocrine does get that anyway if it's moving slowly. Maybe particularly good if you have to move fast and you're also firing through dents. For 1 command point we've got Indomitable Monstrosity. This one's kind of transhuman physiology for monsters. They can't be wounded on a 1 to 3 this phase. A fairly handy damage increase against something really nasty, say if the enemy's lining up some Tau railguns or Storm Surge shots at you perhaps. Reasonably cheap for quite a powerful ability that. Moving on to Epic Deeds, for 1 CP we have Power of the Hive Mind. It allows you to cast 1 more power. Maybe it could be quite nice in combination with that Resonance Barb that allows you to know another one. Maybe seems like a good one for Zoanthropes as well. They probably want to be smiting and also casting another power if they can. For 2 command points we have Death Frenzy. This is a character fights on death one. They get to count as full profile if they have a degrading profile, and they can't use it if they've already fought this phase. Always handy to have these. The amount of damage a Hive Tyrant could do in combat is absolutely insane, so to get it for 2 command points could be well worth it. For 1 CP we have Pheromone Trail. You get to mark one enemy unit within 6 inches of a lictor, and then the rest of your units get +2 to charge against it. I guess maybe the setup's just a little bit harder on this one. You can't just deep strike your lictor in to be able to activate that. I guess maybe it could be better for a lictor lurking behind some line of sight blocking terrain. Jump out, activate this, and then coordinate with your reserves coming in maybe. For 1 CP we have Synaptic Channeling. One Psychic can draw on the expertise of all the others, and it gets to know any of the other Hive Fleets powers that the other Psychers have that are on the table. I guess that's useful if your Synaptic link web was broken and you desperately needed Catalyst or Onslaught in one place maybe. For 1 CP, Synaptic Legacy is a really nice buff to the Synaptic Imperatives. As I mentioned, it could be really annoying if you manage to lose a key Synaptic unit before their buff goes off. This one means that if your Warlord is still on the table, you get to basically remember the buff that they were going to bring, and you can still use that as your Synaptic Imperative for 1 turn, although it still doesn't allow you to double up and use one that you've already used. Could be great, say, if your Tyranid Prime was killed, but then you still want that turn of insane shooting with exploding 6s. Trampling Charge for 1 command point is a really powerful mortal wound one. Your monster charges in, you roll the dice, on a 2 to 4 it does D3 mortal wounds, on a 5+ it does 3. But really the monsters that you want to use it on are the ones with the Horned Chitin keyword, which is really quite a lot of them. On those, on a 2 to 4 it does 3 mortal wounds, and on a 5+ it does a massive D3 plus 3. Seems like really good value there for converting command points into mortal wounds. Lastly, for the Epic Deeds, for 1 command point we have Enfolding Strike. This one's a very specific one for the Parasite of Mortrex. You move over an enemy unit, on a 2 to 5 they take D3 mortal wounds and they become infected. On a 6 they get 3 mortal wounds and also become infected. Infected means they've got a very good chance of taking another D3 mortal wounds next command phase, as well as maybe spawning yourself some rippers if you're lucky. I feel that that's going to be quite a big part of using him in game if you do bring one along. I guess the dream would be to swoop across a unit, give them that, and then also charge something else and infect something in the fight phase. Finally, for the first page for requisitions, we've got the standard 1 command point for extra relics and 1 command point for extra warlord traits. As per normal, you can buy up to 2 extra of each in a 2000 point strike force game. Both of those a bit more relevant for Tyranids now maybe. Now a lot of the warlord traits and relics look pretty dangerous. Moving on to strategic ploys, Tyranids appear to have quite a few of them. Starting out, we have Subterranean Assault. This one's the Trigon one for delivering troops into battle. A troops unit that's in strategic reserve can deploy within 9 inches of an arriving Trigon. They do still need to be set up greater than 9 inches from enemy models, and you do have to invest a bit more than this, as they will have to be put into strategic reserve as well, which will cost you some more CP unfortunately. A bit more of an expensive cost for that kind of delivery now. For 1 command point, Rapid Regeneration regenerates D3 lost wounds on 1 model in the command phase. Probably most relevant if that's going to take you up a bracket. Say you had a Hive Tyrant who'd gone down to his middle bracket, this could have him fighting back on full profile. For 1 CP, we have Invisible Hunter. This one's a Lictor one. It allows you to vanish off the board and reappear somewhere within 9 inches of a board edge at the end of the next movement phase. You can't do it if the Lictors just arrive from reinforcements though, no pinging on and off the board. Next up, for 1 CP, we have Overrun. This one's one if you basically charge an enemy unit, kill the models, and then we're about to consolidate. If you pay 1 command point, then your unit can make a normal move instead of doing that consolidating. Sometimes that could be really meaningful, as a lot of Tyranids have quite a decent normal move characteristic. Say if you used it on the Parasite of Mortrex after it killed a unit, you'd be able to scoot him 16 inches somewhere else. Really quite a nice gamey one that. It could also help you get onto objectives or behind some terrain to get safe. For 1 command point we have Shard Law. This one's a buffing one that's doled out by a synaptic creature. They make a ranged attack and score a hit on 1 enemy unit, and then when your models try and charge that same enemy unit, they roll 3d6 inches on the charge dice and drop the lowest. Quite nice to be able to mark an enemy unit to be able to charge a bit easier. Again, could be a really nice one to coordinate with units coming in from reserve. Perhaps something like a winged Hive Tyrant swooping down, who can re-roll the charge rolls innately. For 1 CP we have Endless Swarm. This one seems great value as you target an Endless Multitudes keyword unit and they get D3+3 models back in the command phase. That one seems like a really easy one to pick up. You could easily be generating something like 40 points worth of Termagants or Gargoyles in just 1 CP, plus any gaming shenanigans that you can do with movement, maybe getting them closer to enemies for easier charges, or sneaking them towards objectives. For 1 CP we have Instinctive Rampage. When your Hive Tyrant's killed by an enemy model, his Tyrant Guard go into Rampage mode. The unit that killed the Hive Tyrant they get +4 to charge against, and also +1 to hit and wound against that unit. Very fun, but really quite situational I think. Not going to see too much play I reckon. For 1 or 2 CP we have Bounding Advance. This one is a Hormagaunt advancing buff. Hormagaunts can auto-advance 6 inches and still charge. Really quite nice considering their move characteristic went up to 10 inches now, so essentially that's 16 inches worth of movement, and then whatever you can roll up after that. If you're using those, then you could easily get a first turn charge that way. It does cost 2 command points if there's 16 or more models in the squad though. For 1 CP we have Encircle the Prey. This allows burrowers or fly units to go back into reserve at the end of a turn, and then you get to deploy by normal deep strike in the next movement phase. Burrowers are things like Raveners, Trigons or Morlocks. Fly units, you've got really quite a lot of options. I guess that could be a way to get a sort of pseudo deep strike out of Gargoyles, jump them up into the sky on turn 1, then have them drift down on objectives the next turn, hopefully somewhere annoying and where their obsec is going to get felt. For 1 CP we have Spore Clouds for Sporecaster units like the Venom Thropes or the Toxicrine. The Sporecaster unit has to remain stationary and it gets +6 inches to its aura abilities, in particular getting that very nice -1 to hit out across really quite a lot of the Tyranid army. For the Toxicrine it's a -1 to hit debuff that affects enemy units, that would in theory get it out to 9 inches. Sticking with the Toxicrine, for 1 command point we have Toxic Entanglement. You use this when your Toxicrine scores a ranged hit on an enemy unit, and it basically represents the model holding the enemy unit in place with its tentacles. You roll a dice and on a 2+, they halve their movement. If they declare a charge, they must charge the Toxicrin as at least one target, at the small expense that the Toxicrin can only charge them, and it does get a +2 to the charge itself. Kind of an interesting one, that one. Certainly could irritate some enemy units. Finally, we get onto war gear stratagems, keying off a fair few of the things that have keywords in the Codex. For 1 CP, we have impaling hooks. These are for flesh hooks units. It gives them a nice easy +1 to hit in melee against non-vehicle, non-monster targets. Very handy for units that have them. I believe the Gene Stealers will get them with some models in the unit. For 1 CP, there's Psychotropic Venom. This is a morale phase 1 where the enemy gets hit by a Lash Whip or Toxic Lashes unit. You suddenly get to spring a -2 leadership and -1 combat attrition on them. I think that is actually situationally really quite helpful. You can just judge whether or not that's going to tip the balance and pull the trigger if so. For 1 CP, there's Acidic Torrent. This one's usable by the Acid Maw units. Each model with an Acid Maw in the unit rolls a dice before the combat. On a 3+, they deal 1 mortal wound. Monsters get to roll 3d6 rather than 1. I guess okay for a little bit of pop-up damage dealing. I feel that this one feels a bit underwhelming on most targets though. For 2 CP, we have Corrosive Viscera. This one's an Acid Blood unit. When it loses a wound in melee, each further wound that it loses causes 1 mortal wound to the enemy on a roll of a 4+, to a maximum of 6 mortal wounds in total. This one does have the potential to be really potent, a fairly easy 2 CP for 6 mortal wounds. Say if your opponent charges something like a Toxicrin or a Haruspex with something monstrously fighty, and you're pretty sure that they're just going to wipe out your monster. For 1 CP, we have Blinding Venom. That's the Gargoyles one. When they're in melee, the enemy is -1 to hit and can't reroll hit rolls either now. They're not really very good in melee, but I guess that could help out, I suppose. And for 1 or 2 command points, we have Pathogenic Slime. This one's a shooting buff, and it gives you 6s to hit auto wound in the shooting phase. Quite nice with anything that's relatively high AP or damage but low strength. Maybe things with banks of devourers come to mind perhaps. In any case, it's a bit pricey at 2 command points for most units, but only 1 command point if you happen to have toxin sacks, which I guess might be able to make it worth it in some occasions. As normal with 9th edition codexes, a massive amount of stratagems to choose from there. I think maybe some of my highlights might be a +1 strength with flesh borers, Tyranid warriors getting -1 damage for 1 CP, the transhuman on monsters thing, the very big mortal wound potential for trampling charge, endless swarm regenerating a whole bunch of models and maybe going on to objectives. I feel like all of those could be really quite potent when they come up, and are all fairly reliable to make happen. I think command points certainly are going to be a little bit on the stretched side. Moving on, let's take a look at Adaptive Physiology. This one's the one that used to pay a command point for certain upgrades for a unit. Now it's a points cost upgrade, and it only applies to monsters, and it's not allowed to apply to characters or titanic monsters, so it's not going on your Hive Tyrants or your Harridans, I'm afraid. As is fairly standard with these kind of upgrades, it's only 1 per model, and max of 1 of each of these upgrades per army. Dermic Symbiosis returns. It's 25 points now, so very pricey, but a 4+ invul save, so kind of worth it. It's pretty great on anything that doesn't already have an invul save. I think maybe models like a Toxicrin might be one of the most optimal targets, loads of wounds and toughness 8, but only a 3+ armor save, so you're going to be relying on that invul quite a bit. Enraged Reserves is 25 points, it allows you to count as double wounds for degrading, and you get to use 1 Epic Deed stratagem for the model free once per game. We've just been through the Epic Deed stratagems. They are all 1 command point ones, so their command point gain is a little bit limited. I kind of feel that between these two, I'm not sure this is really worth the points. Next up, we have Hardened Biology for 15 points. This one gives you +1 save against damage 1 attacks. I feel like damage 1 attacks in general aren't going to be the biggest threat to your monsters. I feel that this could actually be well worth it on Carnifexes perhaps. They get -1 damage against other attacks, so are actually a little bit more susceptible to being hit by mass damage 1 than other things. Still though, a little bit unreliable. You don't know that your opponent's going to shoot loads of damage 1 attacks at that given model. For 20 points, we have Precognitive Sensoria. This one gives your monster the fight's first rule. Kind of handy to have in combat. I guess perhaps could be worth it on something very brutal in combat, maybe like a Haruspex. It does seem a bit borderline for the 20 points though, as it isn't always going to come up. For 15 points, we have Predator Instincts. This one allows you to heroic intervene with a monster, and you can do so at 6 inches. Again, like a lot of these, I do feel it's a bit borderline for the cost, but if your plan for the army is to have 1 tough monster sit in the middle of an objective, this one would allow it to defend said objective very nicely indeed. I think perhaps a more easy one to use is Synaptic Enhancement. only 10 points, and it gives your creature Synapse and Shadow in the warp. That could be easily worth it if you do need another Synapse creature in the mix to help with that linking. Kind of depends on how many Synapse sources that you have flying around, but otherwise that's a great deal for 10 points if you don't have enough. For 15 points we have Voracious Ammunition, which I think is one of my favourites. Each time the model shoots, you select one target that was hit, and on a 2+, they take D3 mortal wounds. That seems absolutely great for me. You only really need to fire this once or twice, and you've probably made back your investment. Seems like nearly an auto-include to have on a shooty unit somewhere in your army. Finally, for 15 points we have Whip Coil Reflexes. Enemy units that run away from your melee will take D3 mortal wounds on the roll of a 2+. That one feels a bit more borderline. Seems pretty unreliable to make happen, and certainly unreliable to make it happen more than once in a game, which you probably want to for 15 points. Overall, I'd say I'm not particularly overwhelmed by this table. I think a lot of them are potentially usable, but really for me the standouts are Dermic Symbiosis for a 4+ invul, Synaptic Enhancement for the 10-point Synaptic creature, and Voracious Ammunition for 15 points, reliable mortal wounds when you're shooting. Moving along, we have 3 secondary objectives for the bugs, and I think they've done a fairly good job of making these feel very Tyranidy. Synaptic Insight is a no mercy, no respite one. This is the one that I believe that they released in chapter approved. It's a slightly weird one where you have synaptic units to have a kill tally over the course of the turn. Each time a synapse model kills a model that's 3 to 5 wounds, you get 1 point, 6 to 9 wounds for 2 points, or 10 or more for 3 points. You score 3 victory points if your tally is 4 or more per battle round. Against the right army, that seems kind of reliable to make happen on maybe turns 2 to 4. I feel you'd struggle to max this out against most targets though. Enemies are often going to be hiding turn 1, and there might be not enough enemies or not enough synapse creatures left at the end of the game to really capitalise. Maybe a somewhat reliable 9 might be a bit harder to take it higher than that. Quite a fun one for shadow operations are Spore Nodes, 4 victory points for completing an action. The action has to be done by troops units within 6 inches of the enemy deployment zone. You can only do it with one troops unit, and you can only do it from the start of the second battle round onwards. The action starts at the end of your movement, so it means that you can move into position first, ends at the end of your turn, so your opponent can't interrupt it, and you basically drop a Spore Node marker. The only function of that is that you can't then do the action again within 6 inches of said marker. I feel like that one might be one that you could quite reliably make happen a few times, but I feel like you'd have to sacrifice quite a lot of troops to do it. Maybe pinging units of gargoyles forward. They could move really quite far, still do the action, though I do imagine that they're just going to get removed straight after. Seems like one that you could consider though, depending on the opponent's army, and maybe particularly if you've got a very long deployment zone, which they're not going to be able to screen very well. Finally, and perhaps the most fun, is Cranial Feasting. This one's a Purge the Enemy one, and it's one where you have to try and hunt your enemy characters or unit champions, things like squad sergeants and exarchs and stuff. You want to kill these in melee. When you do, you roll a dice. If you can roll a 6+, you generate a command point for yourself, which is quite nice, and you get a +2 to the roll if your target was a character, and you also get a +2 to the roll if your unit had feeder tendrils. Things like Venomthropes, Lictors, or Genestealers have those. At the end of the game, you get 3 victory points if you gain a command point at some point, only the 3 on offer for that though. Then you get +1 victory point for each character or unit champion slain in melee, and +3 victory points if the enemy Warlord was slain in melee. Again, I do feel that this one is maybe a bit situational. I feel you really want to use this if your opponent's got absolutely lots of chaff infantry with lots of sergeants heading your way, and you think you're going to be eating a whole bunch of them in combat. If your opponent's got loads of characters, you're probably still better off going Assassinate, I think. Still though, I think that Games Workshop get a whole load of points for flavour for this one. Overall seems fairly reasonable with the secondary objectives. I don't think any of them are necessarily auto-includes. I feel perhaps Spore Node seems like it could be the most powerful. If you can manage to get a unit of gargoyles into the enemy deployment zone and somewhat safe, you could quite easily rack up the points very, very fast. Moving on, let's take a look through the various Tyranid Hive Fleets then, and all the good stuff that they have to offer. Basically, when you pick your Hive Fleet, you can either go for one of the major main ones or opt to make a custom one. If you go for a major one, then you basically get a 2-part chapter tactic type buff, one of which is the primary bit that you've got to use all the time. The other bit is called the adaptive bit, and you're able to swap that out for other rules depending on what your opponent's bringing to the game. That adaptive benefit is often still something quite strong, so it's maybe something you'd only want to do situationally, but you basically get to swap it out for something called a Hyper-Adaptation, and the ones that each Hive Fleet has available will be 2 out of the 3 tables that we'll go over in a second. I feel that the tables of traits are maybe some slightly situational buffs, but I guess if you think it can change the way that your army fights and it might give you an edge over your opponent, some of those buffs could be very handy in certain matchups. Otherwise, if you make a minor custom Hive Fleet, then you actually pick 2 traits from those 3 tables, then you designate one of them as your primary morphology, which you can't swap out, and the other one as your adaptive one, which you then potentially can swap out, provided that trait isn't the one in the same table as your primary morphology. Not really sure if I explained that in the most clear way, to be honest. Basically, you get a trait that you keep all the time, and then you get one that you have the option to swap out for some others. In any case, let's take a look at the major Hive Fleets first. We'll start off with Behemoth. Their primary trait gives you a +1 strength in the first round of combat. Really quite a nice generalist melee buff there, particularly good for anything that's not particularly strong to start with. Units like Gene Stealers and Hormagaunts will really like that a lot. Their adaptive trait allows them to reroll charges, and they can swap them out from either the Hunt or Lurk trait tables. Reroll charges really is quite decent though, at the very least that should save you some command points, and maybe even win you a few more combats. Their Warlord Trait gives you every 6 to wound in melee, causing you an extra mortal wound. Maybe not the most overwhelming, but it seems that that could be really quite powerful on something like a Trigon Prime. They get a fairly crazy 12 attacks, you're almost bound to get some 6s, and you could even increase your chances by that 1 command point to reroll wounds in combat. Their Relic gives you a +1 damage to melee weapons, again kind of helpful for anything that doesn't have particularly great damage to start with. Silent Talons come to mind, or maybe again all those Trigons damage 2 attacks. Their psychic power is Unstoppable Onslaught, Warp Charge 7, and gets broadcast within Synaptic Link range. The psychic power is great as it gives you +1 to wound in melee with a unit. Again, absolutely awesome on low strength units, but pretty much useful on everything. In combination with your +1 strength, that could have Gene Stealers wounding things like Toughness 8 Imperial Knights on a 4+. Finally, their stratagem for 1 or 2 command points is Unparalleled Ferocity. You use it when an infantry unit's attacked, their models get to fight in death if they haven't fought yet. It does cost 2 command points if you use it on an Endless Multitudes unit, but I think it will probably be more useful on something like Tyranid Warriors or Gene Stealers anyway. Not bad to make one unit really painful to remove. For Hive Fleet Kraken, their primary trait gives them +1 AP if their unit made a charge, perhaps most useful on lower AP things. Again, Hormagaunts would really quite like this, also could be quite good on Bone Swords, which are only AP -2. And their adaptive trait that you swap out gives them D3+3 advances, still very fast. Maybe lost a bit of its edge though, now you can't double move units, either with Stratagems or the Swarmlord. Their Warlord trait's a useful one, generating command points. When your opponent spends a stratagem, you get a CP on a 5+, usually that's going to be a net positive. Their Relic's a defensive one, -1 to hit the bearer, and hits can't be re-rolled either. That in combination with that 5+ feel no pain one could give you a seriously tanky Hive Tyrant or something. Their Synaptic Lure power is only Warp Charge 5 and either Synaptic Link or 18-inch range. You target one enemy unit and then you can re-roll charges against it. Not bad I guess, but doesn't weigh up amazingly against the rest of the Hive Mind discipline. Then 1 command point for Opportunistic Advance allows you to automatically advance 8 inches, and you also get no penalty to your hit rolls for firing with assault weapons. Could be good to rush say a unit of Tyranid Termagants forward with Flesh Borers, or probably a lot more powerfully combined with Onslaught for advance and charge, and then you've got a unit with a seriously spooky threat range. Even a slower moving unit like Tyranid Warriors could in theory be charging something like 21 or 22 inches away very reliably indeed. Kraken definitely adds a bit of speed, I'm not sure if it's quite as impressive as a few of the others though. Hive Fleet Leviathan on the other hand, I think is still going to get played quite a lot. Their primary trait is that wound rolls always fail on a 1 or 2 against them. Not much use for monsters, but certainly helps out a lot against the other little bugs getting trodden on. It's a lot more relevant for synapse units though, as they can only ever be wounded on a 4+, regardless of other rules. So some seriously tanky Hive Tyrants or the various other synapse beasties. It'd make that 10-point adaptive physiology for synapse a real steal of a deal as well. Their adaptive trait is good as well. You get to reroll 1 hit roll per time that a unit attacks, either a shooting or fighting. Always good for adding a little bit of extra damage over the course of the game, and of course you can swap that out, this time either from Hunt or Feed. Their Warlord trait is some rerolls. Once per battle round, the Warlord gets to reroll one of either a hit, wound, charge, advance, psychic test, save, or damage results. Quite a lot of options there. I think typically a psychic test and a save are going to be the most valuable out of those, though I guess it will be competing against the other very, very good Leviathan traits in the Leviathan's Codex supplements. Their relic I'm not super enthused about. It's kind of like an intercept mechanic where a Leviathan core or character unit within 6 inches can shoot at one enemy unit that's arriving within 18 inches, so basically shoot down models that are coming from reserve. In reality, I think you're basically never going to get to use that. Being able to bring down reserves somewhere else, or even just hide behind terrain so they won't be shot, I don't really think that's worth it as a relic that you buy in pre-game. Their psychic power, called Hive Nexus, is Warp Charge 7, and that goes within Synaptic Link range. I think this is one of the single massive wins for Hive Fleet Leviathan, as it basically means that the bearer can use a Synaptic Imperative for a unit within link range in addition to the current one that's active. For example, if you wanted to use the Zoanthrope one, that basically means if you have some Zoanthropes somewhere alive towards the core of your army, the bearer could spit out an aura that always gives units a 5+ invul save or a 4+ if they're monsters. That's a really spectacular defensive buff just from a single psychic power to have your hordes walking up the table under. I feel that's almost definitely going to see some play, and you could always change it out for damaging, say repeatedly getting the exploding sixes to hit from the Tyranid Primes one. I feel that's another really powerful reason to play Leviathan in addition to all the supplement things. Finally, for one command point we have Combined Assault. You use this on a unit that's in engagement range of 2 Leviathan units. They both get an extra AP-1 on their melee attacks. It's kind of okay, sometimes that could be relevant, again maybe more so on low AP hordes like Hormagaunts. Overall, mainly from their traits and their power, Leviathan I think is still strong. Gorgon on the other hand is certainly one of the lesser played Hive Fleets at the moment. This codex might well be enough to change that though. It appears that all their attacks will wound vehicles and monsters on a 4+ or better, and as far as I can tell that's both at range and in melee, which I must admit is kind of surprising. I feel like this might be one of the ones that sounds a little bit more powerful than it really is. Most of the things that you really do want to be wounding on a 4+ are very tough because they are monsters or vehicles, but again it's still going to be really solid on a flurry of low strength things. Again, as with quite a lot of these examples, things like Genestealer attacks or Hormagaunts do come to mind. Their adaptive trait is good as well though, it adds yet more damage with a single reroll wound roll when they're attacking. That should help out against everything, including vehicles and monsters. Their Warlord trait tries to spit out another mortal wound or so. You roll a dice for every enemy unit within 3 inches at the start of the fight phase. On a 2 to 5 they take 1 mortal wound, on a 6 they take D3. I guess is okay if you're really near to a bunch of enemy units, but I do feel that's quite underwhelming. Their relic gives you +1 toughness, and your model counts as double wounds for the purposes of degrading. Again, that's another very interesting way that you could get a toughness 9 model out of the Tyranid Codex, say if you slap that on a Hive Tyrant that's walking on foot. Their power is Poisonous Influence, that's a Warp Charge 7/1 that broadcasts within Synaptic Link range, 12 inches or chaining it through other 12-inch Synapse creatures. One Gorgon unit in melee gets 1 mortal wound on each 6 to wound, up to a maximum of 6 at max. It's going to be the best on something with an absolute ton of attacks. Will be fairly powerful on most of the Horde type units. Could be quite good on something like a Morlock as well. They get 18 attacks now. And again, you could make them re-roll the wound rolls for 1 CP. Finally, for a command point, we have Hypertoxicity. For this one, you pick a unit that's got Toxin Sacks, and rather than a 6+ to hit in melee auto wounds, it instead goes to a 5+ instead. That could be punching through a whole load of auto wound attacks on the targets. Again, I feel like you're going to need a very big unit with really quite a lot of low strength attacks to really make that work though. I guess it does up the value of including Toxin Sacks on your units. I feel like Gorgon is almost made for a whole bunch of Tyranid Hormagaunts with the Toxin Sacks upgrade. Moving on, we come to the tunneling horrors of Hive Fleet Jormungandr. Previously, they got light cover, they've swapped that out for dense cover that they get at greater than 12-inch range, or greater than 18-inch range for monster units, which presumably are a bit easier to spot. Certainly doesn't hurt to have a bit more resiliency against shooting. Their adaptive trait allows them to count as half models for the purposes of blast weapons. I guess that's not the worst thing if you are fielding really big hordes of gaunts, but it does feel a bit on the weak side to be honest. Definitely looks like a strong candidate for swapping out for one of the other situational ones. Their Warlord trait allows one unit within Synaptic Link range to ignore cover. Feels like that one could be well worth an include. Could be good in combination with a Tyranid Prime to get you reroll ones to wound with shooting, and then maybe his Synaptic Imperative. You've got a really good, well-rounding shooting unit there. It depends if you've got something good that's core to buff, I suppose. Their relic I think is really quite bad. At the end of their movement, you select one enemy unit less than 12 inches away, you roll 3d6 versus their leadership. If you get higher, then it stops them doing any actions, and can't start any new ones. Seems pretty terrible really, kind of unreliable to stop those actions in the first place, even if you can get them in range, and even if your opponent doesn't have another unit to do that desperately needed action. Their psychic power is Lurking Moors. That one's warp charge 7 and is either synaptic link range or 18 inches. It's basically a debuff for an enemy unit. When the Jormungandr units attack it in combat, then your units will get an extra AP -1. Not terrible, though again not exactly outstanding. Finally, for one command point, we have Buried in Weight, the signature Jormungandr move of burying all their units underground and then emerging when they least expect. It basically gives any non-Titanic model deep strike. They emerge from greater than 9 inches away from the enemy, and you can use this stratagem twice in Strike Force games. I think that stratagem is potentially one of the most interesting things about the Hive Fleets. Basically, they're the ones that can get you deep strike on things that shouldn't really be able to. Otherwise, I think the dense cover thing is okay, but the rest isn't particularly inspiring. Moving on, for Kronos, these are the shooty and psychic Hive Fleets. Their primary trait gives you an extra 4-inch range to your guns, and if you get within half range of the enemy units, then you also get an extra AP -1 on your guns as well. Those two work together quite nicely, as the one makes it easier to do the other. Getting an extra pip of AP can be really quite big for certain weapons. Pyrovores would absolutely love this, as would just about anything armed with devourers. You could be spitting out 24 strength 6 shots from a Karn effect with devourers. Making all of those AP -1 will be quite a big deal. Their Warlord trait is an anti-psycho one. Enemy cycles peril on any double within 18 inches, not just a double 1 or a double 6. Very spooky if you're against Grey Knights or Thousand Suns, very useless against a lot of the field. Their Relic's an interesting and really quite powerful debuff ability. You get to select one enemy unit within synaptic link range, and that unit can't re-roll any hit rolls, wound rolls, or psychic tests. Really quite a nice one if you are targeting an enemy unit that's going to be buffed by multiple characters. Turning off re-rolls so easily is just really good. Their psychic power, Symbiostorm, was really quite a good one as it allowed you to get exploding 6s to hit. It has had a bit of a side grade. It now gives you +1 strength to your ranged weapons. A fair bit of the time that is actually going to be stronger, though it's definitely a bit less reliably good on higher strength weapons. Quite nice that it doesn't have to target core units or anything. Could allow you to get things like Pyrophore Fire to all the way to strength 7, and potentially the same for things like Flesh Borers if you combined it with that Scorchbug stratagem. In any case, quite a nice shooting one that you can turn on when you need. Finally, their stratagem Deepest Shadow is an anti-psycho one. I think the previous version was a lot more powerful to be honest, just turning off a psychic power on the roll of a 4+. This one's now a fun one to punish enemy psychers if they fail to cast a spell. For 1 CP they take D3 mortal wounds. You have to have a Kronos Psyker within 18 inches of them, and then for the rest of that phase, if any other Psykers fail their spell within 18 inches of your Psyker, then they'll have the same effect happen again. Definitely fun to pile a few mortal wounds onto the enemy's valuable models, but maybe not quite as strong as turning off a psychic power on the roll of a 4+. In any case, if you want to go really heavy on the ranged Tyranids, Kronos seem a pretty reasonable way to do so. Finally, for the major Hive Fleets, we have Hive Fleet Hydra. These are the incredibly swarmy Hive Fleet, and their primary adaptation is to get +1 to hit in melee if there's fewer models in the enemy unit than are in yours, and apparently for the purposes of this, vehicles and monsters count as 5 models. From the face of it, that sounds like you might still give your outnumbering advantage even if you're a monster fighting against a squad of say 4 infantry, but I have a feeling that that might come up less often than you might expect. Their adaptive trait gives everyone a +1-inch move and also +3-inch consolidation, so just in general they will be very slightly faster than most Hive Fleets. I'm sure that will add up from time to time, but 1 inch extra movement isn't exactly the most convincing buff. Their Warlord trait is a really big regeneration one. If your model's injured, it gets to regenerate D3 wounds at the start of the command phase, and I feel like this one might have been worded a bit clumsily. They say at the start of the command phase as opposed to your command phase, so it kind of implies that you might get this both in your turn and your opponent's turn, hopefully heading back to full health in no time at all. Might be a typo that, I wouldn't be too surprised if it got FAQs. Their Relic allows you to re-roll wound rolls with ranged attacks. I guess that's kind of okay, but I sort of struggle to think what you'd actually want to take that on, compared with maybe taking one of the ranged Relic guns, and I think those boosted stat lines are generally going to outperform having re-rolls. Their psychic power is Psychic Shriek. This is a Warp Charge 6-1 that goes in Synaptic Link range or within 18 inches. This one again rewards you for swarming the enemy. You get to roll 1d6 per infantry or beast model within 3 inches of the target, or get to roll 3d6 per monster within 3 inches. For every 5+ that you roll, you deal 1 mortal wound, up to a maximum of 6. In theory, if you've got 30 models next to your target, that should usually average you the full 6. Potentially powerful, but needs a fair bit of positioning. Finally, for 1 command point, we have Critical Mass. Again, this one's doubling down on outnumbering the foe. You get to reroll wound rolls in melee against a unit that has fewer models than yours. No caveats about vehicles and monsters on that one. That's going to be a really nice one whenever it applies, whether you just happen to be a fair few Tyranid warriors attacking a hard target, or if you've got a big horde of Hormagaunts or 10 Gene Stealers taking out a medium-sized infantry squad. If you like smaller bugs in melee, it seems that Hydra can reward them quite a lot. Overall, I think that really quite a lot of the major Hive Fleets have something to offer. Behemoth seems interesting just for the raw damage and might it can bring. Kraken's big advance and charge threat range could be fun. I think Leviathan's going to be very popular just for that psychic power, their traits and their supplements. And maybe Kronos are particularly interesting if you want to build around ranged bugs. The extra AP at half range could make a really big difference to quite a lot of units. We've mentioned them a few times already, but these are the 3 tables of traits that you can swap out to if you think that one of these could be more helpful than your Hive Fleet's adaptive trait. They're broken down into the 3 tables, Hunt, Lurk and Feed, and most of the normal Hive Fleets get 2 out of these. It's specified next to their adaptive trait which 2. The Hunt ones are Consolidate 3 inches more, Shoot after falling back but at -1 to hit, +1 to charge rolls. Endless Multitude units can pre-game move 6 inches if they're set up within the own deployment zone, and an army-wide heroic intervention. Just on raw power, I think that +1 to charges is one of the stronger ones. That could be great with anything coming in from reserve to get a really good chance to get them in combat. Shooting after falling back, the Endless Multitude one and the heroic intervention all seem usable though. I think the Lurk one really has some very good counter tactics though. The Lurk traits are counting AP-1 as AP0, getting an extra +1 to your save if you're receiving the benefit of cover from a terrain feature, monster units counting as Obsec and counting as 5 models if they have 10 or more wounds, counting as double the wounds remaining for damage tables, and re-rolling Deny the Witch and a +3 inches to your psychic power ranges. I think perhaps one of the best situational ones out of those is counting AP-1 as AP0. If you've got an enemy with absolutely tons of AP-1, that could make them very sad indeed. The objective secured monster thing also seems great. I guess if you've got loads of monsters but you're not Crusher Stampede, that could be a really nice way of holding down the midfield. The Deny the Witch thing could also be handy to jump in with if you've got enough psychers to do some denying, and also you're fighting someone who's got loads and loads of psychic spells. Finally, for the feed ones, one of them gives wound rolls of 6 and extra pip of AP, that's with ranged attacks only. One ignores penalties for advancing and shooting assault weapons, moving and shooting with heavy weapons, or firing heavy weapons in engagement range. One stops the enemy army from doing overwatch or setting to defend. There's one that gives you a 3-inch normal move if you fail a charge, and one that means that you ignore modifiers to your move characteristic, advances and charges. I feel for that one maybe it's a bit more slim pickings. I guess maybe a no overwatch one could be kind of relevant if you think it's going to be a really big deal in your game. Also, if you're on a table with loads and loads of difficult ground, then move modifiers might not be the worst to ignore. Could also be handy against certain armies like Tau, who've got a fair few ways to give you -2 to charge. Still though, out of the whole list, I think that the Hunt and the Lurk ones seem a bit better. In particular, I really like that +1 to charge rolls, and objective secured monsters seems pretty reasonable as a second trait as well. So with the majority of the army-wide rules out the way, let's talk about some datasheets. As we know, the new model that's going to be coming for the Tyranids is the Parasite of Mortrex. The wording seems a little bit confused. It doesn't currently appear to be a unique character that you can only take one of, but I'm going to guess that that's intended to be the case. Admittedly, I might just be misreading something. In any case, this Ripper Spawning Death Machine is a fast attack choice at 80 points, an infantry character with a fly and synapse keywords, and it also generates shadow in the warp, really quite handy on such a fast moving critter that's going to be moving towards enemy lines. He moves crazy fast with a movement of 16, hits on 2s in combat, his strength and toughness 5, 6 wounds, 6 attacks, leadership 8 and a 4+ save. Maybe not enormously tanky, but toughness 5 helps out, and he's also -1 to hit, and he can't re-roll any hit rolls against it either. With that big 16-inch movement, he's certainly in a place to threaten first turn charges if anyone deploys a bit too aggressively. Finally, if you like, he can deep strike, and when he comes down from the sky, he gets to re-roll charges on the turn that he arrives. With the big move characteristic though, I think it's going to be tempting to start him on the board. Weapons wise, he has clawed limbs, strength user AP-2 and damage 1, and then a barbed ovipositor. That's the way he can do his parasitic infestation. At strength +1, AP-1 and damage 1, he makes one single extra attack with this, and that's how he activates his fun special rules. Basically, the parasite can make enemy units infected. He can either do it with that ovipositor or a unit that he's moved across with that one command point stratagem that we mentioned back in the stratagems section. In any case, if he makes a successful wound roll, he infects them in melee, they take 1 mortal wound, and then at the start of your opponent's command phase, they roll a dice. On a 1 to 3, they just take d3 mortal wounds and they stop being infested. On a 4 to 6, they take d3 mortal wounds and remain infested. And either way, if they take 2 or more mortal wounds, then you get to set up a free friendly Ripper Swarm that pops up within 3 inches of the enemy, as it presumably bursts out of their chest or something. I guess in theory you'd hopefully want to jab a few enemy units, and hopefully they get whistled away with a turn or 2 of mortal wounds, and then also have some annoying rippers to deal with, which might even take another chunk out of them if you're lucky. Finally, in addition to that, the infection does give you a debuff. The It Itches rule means they lose the objective secured rule if they had it. Could be kind of handy if, say, there was only one model left and there was some Ripper Swarms created. It does mean that you could even steal an objective. For 80 points, he does seem like really quite a fun utility piece, just very rarely going to be a good idea to have him on the front lines where he can get attacked. Really feels like he needs to be a bully unit, zipping around and taking out enemy objective holders, while not letting anything too serious get a hold of him. I feel like he might be a unit that could be quite powerful in the right hands. That 16-inch movement is a massive threat all in itself. It's just certainly going to need you to know exactly what to do with him to get the best value though, rather than just charging him blindly into the enemy. Moving on though, let's go through the other sections in the Codex, starting out with the troops. One section in particular that's seen quite a major shake-up. Gargoyles are here now, Rippers and Gene Stealers have gone away, Rippers to the fast attack section, and Gene Stealers to elites. First up we have the Tyranid Warriors, up to 25 points from 17, and basically massively buffed in just about every way. Again, +1 strength and toughness, and ballistic skill 3+, and the vast majority of weapons are included in their points cost now, rather than charging extra. Perhaps one of the best options in combat are the Bone Swords, strength +2, AP-2, damage 2. I take the pair of them over the Lash Whip I think, as you get +1 attack rather than re-roll ones to hit. The Scything Talons are buffed, they're just strength user AP-1 and damage 1, but you get +2 attacks, potentially very nice to have as a secondary weapon. And Rending Claws are just if you want to spit out a whole load of strength 6 AP-4 damage 1 attacks, though I think in general the Bone Swords are probably going to be more useful. For the ranged weapons, you've got the option of the Death Spitter, improved to AP-2, Spine Fist, which are a 2-shot pistol at strength 5 AP-1 damage 1, the Warrior Devourer, which is now up to 5 attacks at strength 4, and then the 2 gun upgrades that actually cost points are 5 points for either a Barbed Strangler or Venom Cannon. The Stranglers are strength 6, and the Venom Cannon is now heavy D3, strength 8, AP-3, and damage 2. Finally, there's a trio of optional upgrades. Adrenal Glands cost 15 points for the whole unit, +1 strength and +1 move. The strength could be quite nice for getting Bone Swords to strength 8 maybe. Toxin Sacs now always allow you to auto wound on 6s in melee, they cost 10 points for the whole unit. And Flesh Hooks now allow you to ignore vertical movement as well, they cost 5 points for the unit, and all of them have some associated stratagems. I feel like the Toxin Sacs seem quite good value just for 10 points. Obviously you're going to get more value out of them the bigger warrior squad that you have. Finally, warriors also allow you to take a Tyranid Prime now as a slotless choice if you have one of these in the troop slot. Certainly doesn't hurt with his powerful command abilities, particularly if you're hurting for some HQ slots. Otherwise for the troops choices we have the Hordes. Termagants have rather surprisingly gone up to 7 points per model, up from 5, and the main things that they've gained for their trouble are getting a 5+ armor save, and Flesh Borers being massively buffed to 18 inches, strength 5, AP-1, damage 1. I must admit, really quite surprising for Termagants of all things. Seems weird that they now cost more points than say things like Troop Mercenaries. Otherwise it's not actually all that great news for them, they can no longer mix and match weapons, For some reason they made their devourer super terrible now. It costs +1 points, and now it gives you only 2 shots at 18 inches, strength 3, AP 0. I don't know who thought that was worth more than a flesh borer. And spine fists are free, but also fairly rubbish I think. Pistol 2, strength 3, AP 0, damage 1. Again, it seems hard to turn down the flesh borer for them. Again, they can take adrenal glands and toxin sacs for the similar buffs. They're both 1 point per model. They get the swarming masses rule, and they've got those endless multitudes and core infantry tags. And like the Hormagaunts, they can no longer get a buff for attacking in large numbers. Hormagaunts again are increased in points, up to 8 points from 6. Again, the 5+ save and a 10-inch move up from 8, and their melee is looking really quite a lot more vicious as well. 3 attacks hitting on 4s at AP -1. They are only strength 3 though, unless you pay 2 command points for adrenal glands to get them up to strength 4. The bounding leap now only gives you the +3 inches to pile in, not consolidate, and I feel they're the sort of unit that Games Workshop wants you to build around, but I think they are going to feel really quite underpowered at 8 points. You really do need to invest quite a lot into them to really make them efficient, I think. Finally, and newly into the troop slot are the Gargoyles. They're also 8 points. Their max squad's now 20, and they're kind of similar to the Termagants with the new Flesh Borers, though they do remain at a 6+ save, so aren't quite as tough. The other thing that they lost was innate deep strike, which they had when they were a fast attack. I guess maybe they didn't want to give that innately to troops, but still though I think they're a really interesting looking troops unit. Having a big 12-inch movement with OBSEC is good enough to sell them all by itself. I potentially feel that out of the 3, Gargoyles are one of the most interesting hordes. Not really significantly worse damage output than the Termagants, and they get to move very fast with their OBSEC. It does feel kind of weird though that just Tyranids in general have their very cheapest models in their hordes being 7 or 8 points. Moving on to the elite slot, and we'll start with the unit that escaped from the troops. The Genestealers are 16 points, up from 13, and they really have had quite a weird mixed bag of changes. On the downsides, their squad is capped at 10, and they didn't really get anywhere near as big buffs as the pure strain Genestealers from Genestealer Cult. They do get 4 attacks that hit at AP -3, but they only hit on 3s, not 2s, and their lightning reflexes is a bit worse. They only get a 5+ invul against shooting, not a 4+. However, they are a core infantry unit, and interestingly they can forward deploy, so you can set up your Genestealers in the midfield anywhere that's greater than 9 inches from the enemy or their drop zone. Quite powerful to have a screening unit that can set up in the midfield for NIDs. Otherwise, upgrade wise, 1 out of the 4 models can take flesh hooks or an acid maw for free. You may as well, as it just gives them some handy keywords. Extended carapaces cost 1 point and give you a 4+ armor save, though limit your move. They can take toxin sacs, though they're very expensive at 3 points. 19 points per model is really pricey. And they've got the interesting ability to drop an infestation node if you pay 20 points for it. You do this instead of moving, and then if you hang around there and your squad takes casualties, you get to regenerate D3 Genestealers per turn. In a rather surprising shake-up, they have lost advance and charge as well. Kind of weird as the pure strain Genestealers do have it still. But I guess forward deploying you've got some very easy turn 1 charges if you really want them. Finally, kind of like the Tyranid Warriors, they allow you to take a Broodlord Slotless if you want one of those about. Again, kind of handy for easing pressure on the HQ slots. Hard to say too much if Genestealers are better or worse. I'm sure we'll see a couple of small units of them included in a fair few lists though. Dominating the midfield really early is very nice indeed. Next up we have a couple of the Elite's Choice monsters, the Haruspex for 170 points, up from 155, and also the Maliceptor. As we'll be seeing, a whole load of the Tyranid monsters have got huge stat line buffs. The Haruspex seems fairly typical, most of them tend to hit on 3s now. It has movement 8, 15 wounds, 5 attacks, and a 2+ save. Weapons wise, they basically all got slightly better. The Grasping Tongue has damage 3 and can target characters directly. Could be a fun way to assassinate an enemy warlord if you get lucky. The Big Maw gets a massive triple attacks at strength user AP -1 and damage 2. Pretty scary at 15 attacks there. And the Claws go up to strength 14, AP -3 and damage D3+3. That will certainly chew through some heavy hitters if you're not fighting hordes. Keywords wise, it isn't core. Most of the monsters aren't besides the Carnifex. It does have both Acid Blood and Horned Chitin though. Both of those could dole out a fair amount of mortal wounds with the stratagem. Death throws on this, like on most monstrous creatures, only affects the closest enemy unit and only for D3 mortal wounds. Kind of handy that it doesn't risk killing the rest of your bugs nearby though. Finally, it gives -2 leadership for enemies nearby, and it can regenerate wounds caused by any attacks now, not just the maw, to a maximum of 3 per phase. It just looks like an all-around bruiser, either masses of anti-infantry attacks, or a few really quality ones to deal with heavies. The Maliceptor's 170 points. It gets kind of similar changes, but only has 3 attacks and a 3+ save. Its Scything Talons have got a fair bit more threatening, either double attacks at strength user AP -3 and damage 2, or going with a piercing strike at strength 3, AP -4 and damage 2d3. Its psychic has changed in a couple of ways. It can now only deny 1 psychic power per turn, but what it can do in the psychic phase has changed a bit. It's got the option of doing an encephalic diffusion psychic action. That one's really quite a nice defensive bubble. Ranged attacks get -1 strength when they target your units within 6 inches of it. Not bad if you know that you're going to be stomaching some fierce shooting. In addition, its Psychic Overload rule has been changed quite a bit. If you do a psychic action or cast a power on a roll of a 7+, you deal mortal wounds to the closest enemy within 12 inches, 3 mortal wounds if you've got 4 wounds remaining, or a few less if the Maliceptor's taken damage and has less wounds left. Overall, he seems like really quite an interesting option. The -1 strength thing certainly seems powerful, particularly say if you combined it with that Zoanthrope Synaptic Imperative. You could have some seriously tanky nids going up the board who really aren't going to be too concerned by enemy firepower. Next up we have the reimagined versions of Lictors. Kind of interestingly, and not what I would have expected, Games Workshop has almost doubled the points on these. A standard Lictor has become 70 points, but they do seem to have done a lot of work to make it worth it. His stats have pretty much got massively better across the board. He moves 10, has strength 7, toughness 5 and 5 wounds, 6 attacks, leadership 8 and a 4+ save. Just about every stat is improved. The claws have gained an extra couple of pips of AP, and with 6 attacks he could easily be clearing out a medium infantry squad in a single round of combat. And like the rest of the units, the flesh hooks don't do any damage anymore, but allow the lictor to ignore vertical distance when moving vertically. On the defensive front, he's always -1 to hit, both at range and melee. If he's in cover, he can't be shot if he's greater than 12 inches away. It means that he could be pretty difficult to deal with if he's on the outskirts of the army, and also gets a 5+ invul, so a small chance to avert some high power damage. Finally, if you choose to deep strike him, which I think often you'd want to, you've got to set up somewhere that's either within 6 inches of a board edge or a terrain feature. Usually you've still got to set up greater than 9 inches away from enemy models, though if you happen to set him up entirely within your own deployment zone, you can set up just outside of 6 inches of them. Could give you a really powerful tool to repel enemies that are venturing too close into your territory. Finally, you get to re-roll charges on the turn that he appears, so does at least have a pretty reasonable chance of making it to combat. Will be interesting to see if this is enough to make the lictors worth it to people. Still at least fairly fragile for the cost, particularly at 70 points, but has just gained a whole load of abilities that make it feel like a real commando, I think. Certainly doesn't seem like it's just going to be relegated to the role of being an action monkey anymore. Death Leaper, the character version of the lictor, is up to 95 points. He gets most of the lictor things, 7 attacks, a 4+ invul, and a few other random special rules, such as enemies can't start to do actions within 6 inches of it. Randomly, opponents can't use stratagems on units that are within engagement range of it, and he also has the character keyword. I think my instincts are that the standard lictor is probably better than Death Leaper still. A few of those buffs do seem a bit situational. Next up we have the Spore Cloud creators, the Venomthropes and the Toxicrin. Venomthropes are now 35 points, up from 33, again have massive sweeping stat line boosts, an 8-inch move, hit on 3s, strength and toughness of 5, 4 wounds and now 5 attacks up from 2, and have a save of a 4+. For all that, I don't really think that the 2 points increase is really all that big. In melee, their Toxic Lashes with all the attacks are now AP -1 damage 1, but they wound on 2+ against anything that isn't a vehicle or Titanic. They did lose their small ranged attack though. Really though, I think the reason that you bring the Venomthropes is their trio of special rules, mainly the one that makes your units -1 to hit at range, but they also have a 4+ chance to keep an enemy unit in melee when they try and fall back, and their Toxic Miasma gives them a 3+ chance for one unit to take 1 mortal wound and fight last in the fight phase. That's a trio of really handy support abilities right there. I could easily see a unit of these advancing up with your heavy hitters. They've got really quite a lot of keywords as well. Core infantry with fly, toxic lashes, feeder tendrils, and sporecaster. The Toxicrin with all the tentacles is 150 points, the same as he was before. He's moved to the elite section from the heavy support, and again has had a massive stat line boost. the seemingly standard toughness 8 and 15 wounds, and he's gone up to 12 attacks. Though admittedly they are damage 1, they have a similar rule to the Venom Thropes, wounding non-vehicles on a 2+. He also does back that up with a ranged attack, now 2d6 shots at strength user AP-2 damage 1, with that same wounding rule. This thing's definitely going to be death incarnate to 1 wound infantry. Again, like the Venom Thropes, he has a trio of special rules himself. This guy has a 3+ chance to stop enemies from falling back, and gets +1 to that roll for infantry. Rather than giving friendly units -1 to hit, this one makes enemy units -1 to hit if they're within 3 inches of it. And the miasma rule gives it a 4+ chance to make each enemy unit within engagement range suffer D3 mortal wounds and also fight last. It's got very similar keywords to the Venom Thropes and also Acid Blood. Again, it does seem really quite solid, brings a lot of utility to the table. I do wonder whether it's going to just outcompete more hard-hitting damage dealers though. Next up we have Zone Thropes for 50 points. They're unchanged in cost, they've got a 5-inch move, their weapon skill's worse to a 5+ to hit, and I still think that they're really quite durable. They may only have an invul save of 4+, not 3+ now, but their toughness 5 and 4 wounds. They have of course gained that great Synaptic Imperative, the one that can give monsters 4+ invuls, but it seems that their more generic psychic rules have changed a bit. They can only cast 1 power and deny 1 power now, but they basically amp up Smite and Witchfires massively more for more models in the unit. For each model in the unit you get +1 to cast Smite and Witchfires, and +1 mortal wound per smite up to a maximum of +3. I guess in theory with just a 3 strong model unit of Zone Thropes, that's going to give you pretty well an auto cast of smite, and it should be doing D3+3 wounds. I think they could be really quite an easy one to use the 1 command point to cast another psychic power on. That could allow them to activate the Hive Mind discipline and still smite away. The Tyrant Guard I think were a unit that were definitely in need of a revamp. They're 40 points up from 38, and again gain some pretty reasonable defensive stats, going up to toughness 6 and 4 wounds, and like a lot of the bigger stuff acquired a 2+ save. Their Scything Talons and Rending Claws work the same as warriors. Their unique options are Bone Cleavers and Whips, which are free to swap out for strength user AP-1 and damage 2. Crushing Claws seem like they're a bit of a luxury though, it costs 10 points to upgrade to those, strength +3, AP-3 and damage 2. Again they can pick up adrenal glands or toxin sacs, and the main reason that you want to bring them into your army is to guard Hive Tyrants. Basically now if you have a Hive Tyrant within 3 inches of Tyrant Guard, your opponent just can't directly target the Hive Tyrant, so in theory that's a luxury you could buy yourself for 120 points. In addition, to further reward them working together, Hive Tyrants give a +1 attack to this unit if they're within 3 inches, making them a little bit better in melee as well. Finally, you can now bring them completely slotless if you do have a Hive Tyrant present, so they're not going to take up too much space in detachments. I guess potentially these could be worth a second look, seeing as Hive Tyrants have got a lot bigger and a lot more threatening, might actually be potentially worth the investment of protecting them. Finally, for the elite section we have the Pyrovores, perhaps one of the most improved units in the entire Codex. These things just got massively buffed stats at strength 5, toughness 5, 5 wounds and a 3+ save. A crazily strong profile for just 30 points. They've got Acid Blood and Acid Morse, and their perhaps slightly weedy strength 5 AP-1 flamer now either gives you d6 shots at strength 6, AP-2 and damage 2, or a great big 2d6 shots at strength 4, AP-1. They're still not going to be the strongest unit ever against tanks and hard hitters, but for their cheap investment and auto-hitting firepower, they're going to be quite good at blasting enemy infantry straight off the board. Next up, we're off to the fast attack, and we've got the vast improvement on the Morlock. This thing remains 125 points, and like the Trigon has been moved here from the heavy support section, which I guess was a bit overloaded. Like the rest of the monsters, the Morlock's just massively buffed, 10-inch move, hits on 3s, strength and toughness 7 now rather than 6, a big 14 wounds up from 12, a 3+ save from 4, and perhaps most notably of all, a crazy 16 attacks, though admittedly they are all at strength 7 AP-1 damage 1, not exactly the biggest chunkiest profile compared with some of its cousins. Still though, that should be enough to make a mess of some infantry, and it backs it up with a distensible jaw attack, a 2+ to cause D3 mortal wounds, and a jab with its toxin spiked tail, another single extra attack at strength 7 AP-3 and damage 2. You can swap out the tail for a biostatic rattle. That's a funny debuff roll that gives you a 3d6 versus leadership roll, and if you beat the target's leadership, then they can't re-roll any hits or wounds. A bit situational for me, I think. Or a prehensile pincer tail, which I think is just worse than the toxin spike. They can take adrenal glands or toxin sacs for 10 points each, and its Terror from the Deep rule has been vastly reimagined. You now basically select a turn when the Morlock could come in and doesn't. You put a marker down somewhere on the board, the enemy scrambles to get out the way, and then next turn you deal a bunch of mortal wounds as you come up. Anyone within 6 inches of the marker takes d3 mortal wounds on a 3 to 6, and you get some bonuses to the roll if the enemy units are in bigger numbers. The Morlock then sets up anywhere that's within 12 inches of that marker, though it can't charge if it's setting up anywhere within 9 inches of enemies. Again, quite an underwhelming unit that just got thoroughly scary. This thing's going to be an absolute bane to enemy infantry squads. Anything that can't deal with heavies is going to have a terrible time against this. Its cousin the Trigon is 145 points, a little down from 150. Again, it's moved here from the heavy support, and the Trigon Prime went to the HQ slot. Statline wise, it's kind of similar to the Morlock. It only has 12 attacks, but arguably I think is still perhaps better in combat as it makes them at strength 7, AP 3, damage 2. It doesn't get that Terror from the Deep mortal wound thing, but it does keep the tail options, and does get the -1 to hit, the same as the Morlock. Otherwise, in the fast attack, Rippers seem a bit worse to be honest. They're 15 points rather than 12, haven't really changed in profile, don't have Obsec, though they did get a small benefit for a +1 to save against ranged attacks. And now strangely you pay for the Spine Moors per unit, it costs 10 points for the squad. The Raveners cost really quite a lot more, they were 20 points, they're now 30. They've kind of picked up very similar buffs to the Warriors, a 3+ ballistic skill, strength and toughness 5, 4 wounds, 5 attacks, and a 4+ save. Their claws really aren't all that impressive still though, only AP -2, damage 1, though they have gained a native -1 to hit in all phases, so will be a bit tougher. And they've got a nice special rule that helps them out in melee, getting to reroll 1s to hit if they're not equipped with any ranged weapons. Finally, for the fast attack, we have the Living Artillery. The Spore Binds are 10 points, unchanged from before. They've got a few meager profile buffs, 4-inch move, toughness 3, and a 6+ save. They have all the Spore Mine rules that we talked about earlier, no morale, no actions, no charges, no scoring objectives, no screening enemy reserves out, no lookout sir, and no blocking enemy movement. They just don't really do very much at all besides explode on you, and to be honest for 10 points they're still not that great at that. They have to get within 3 inches, you roll a dice for 2 to 4 to get 1 mortal wound or 5+ for d3. I think that's quite underwhelming for the investment. I'd probably try and spawn the Spore Mines in from somewhere, not buy them in. The Mucilid Spore though I think is a bit more interesting. At least it's toughness 4 and 4 wounds, so we'll take some trivial firepower to take down. But if the enemy does approach the Mucilid, it is actually going to cause some damage. Its explosion will deal d6 mortal wounds on a 2 to 4, or a d3+3 on a 5 or more. That's significantly better for the points cost than the Spore Mines. Next up we're into the big guns of the heavy support, and we're starting out with the Biovores, 45 points down from 50, and in a rare act of insanity from Games Workshop, they haven't buffed the stat line through the roof. The only stat changes they really got were a strength +1 and AP -1 on their melee weapons, not exactly the biggest deal. For the Spore Mine launcher, you now have to choose whether you're trying to spawn in Spore Mines or whether or not you're directly dealing damage. If you're doing damage, you get d3 shots for 1 mortal wound each, you still only hit on force, and they've got a slightly unexpected debuff in that their target must be visible to a synapse unit if the Biovore can't see it. It doesn't just ignore line of sight now. Now the misses no longer spawn any Spore Mines, instead you've got to do an action instead of shooting to do that, and you lay them down somewhere that's greater than 6 inches from an enemy unit. You get to spit out d3 mines per Biovore as a bit of area denial. Interestingly, they're not a core unit, so you'll be a bit more limited as to what sort of buffs you can layer on them. It's really not the best news for the other artillery either though. The Hive Guard increased to 50 to 60 points, up from 40 to 45, though they do get a fair bit tankier as a result. They're up to toughness 6, 4 wounds and a 3+ save now, all fairly decent buffs. The main news is their Impaler Cannon that costs +10 points over their 50, that is now only 24-inch range, not 36-inch range. It gets 3 shots rather than 2, but they're only made at strength 6 now, not strength 8. Like the Biovores, it can only ignore line of sight if a synapse unit can see their target, which means they're not just going to be able to point and delete enemy units like they were before. The Impalers still do ignore light cover, They get to ignore hit modifiers if the target's visible to a synapse creature, and the Hive Guard have picked up a rather neat trick of sacrificing their movement to do an action to count as objectives secured, and also 3 models for objectives. With that very tanky profile, they could still be a very good choice to hold down a home field objective, but their roles definitely changed quite a lot. Their other gun, the shot cannon's been reimagined a bit. Only 2 shots at strength 7 AP -2 damage 3. It auto wounds on a 4+ versus vehicles and causes a mortal wound when it does, so maybe that might have a little bit more play. I'm still not convinced it's massively great damage output. I'd bear in mind that these guys aren't core either. I feel like these guys have really got hit by the nerf bat pretty hard. Maybe Games Workshop punishing them from being such a great source of firepower before. Next up for the other gunbugs, we have the Tyrannifex and the Exocrine. The Tyrannifex now starts at 170 points, up from 155, and like just about everything else, it's picked up some stat line buffs. It moves 9, hits on 3s, a big 17 wounds up from 14, and gained some very nice 2+ armor. Its 3 main guns have all been reimagined. The Flesh Borer Hive now basically packs the firepower of an entire squad of termagants. 24 inches, assault 30, strength 5, AP -1, damage 1. You're essentially getting 38 shots at that profile when you add in the new buffed Stinger Salvo. Though you can trade it out for the Acid Spray, +5 points for 18 inches, d6 +6 shots, strength 6, AP -3, damage 2 flamer attacks, or potentially the tank busting Rupture Cannon for 20 points, 48 inches, heavy 3, strength 14, AP -4, damage d6 +4. Certainly a very solid bit of anti-tank. I feel like that is going to lose out fairly hard though if it does come up against Invuls. Really quite a swingy weapon really. I feel like the Flesh Borer one is actually one of the ones that I find the most interesting. And otherwise, other interesting things about it is that it gets death throws for d6 mortal wounds, not just d3, and it does have that Horned Chitin keyword, meaning it can potentially charge for a whole ton of mortal wounds if you use that stratagem. The Exocrine is 170 points as well, up from 155 points too. Again, he's got a bunch of nice stat line improvements, hitting on 3+, 15 wounds from 12, and a 2+ armor save as well. The bioplasmic cannon has maybe had a bit of a side grade. It no longer fires twice, so it is getting a few less shots. Instead it gets d3 +6 shots at strength 8, AP -4, and damage 3. If it moves less than half its maximum move distance, then it gets ignores cover as well. Doesn't seem like the worst choice if you are looking for a little bit of ranged anti-tank, but I'm not sure if I'm too convinced if it's going to be one of the strongest range platforms in the Codex at that profile. Finally, for heavy support, we have the Carnifexes, perhaps the most iconic Tyranid unit, and also ridiculously super flexible, as you can see by the crazy amount of options here. Maybe the most important changes are to its stat line: 8-inch move, hitting on 3s in melee, though still at 4's a ballistic skill. It goes up to 9 wounds and a 2+ armor save, and gets -1 damage when you attack it, similar to Space Marine Dreadnoughts. Basically between those little changes, they are massively more tanky. Otherwise, they are core monstrous creatures, so they can get buffs better than virtually anything else. They still have that rule where they separate out into different units, and when they charge into combat, they get +1 attack, usually meaning 5. Weapons wise, in combat, you either choose between the Crushing Claws or Scything Talons. The Scything Talons are free, so their base loadout is basically 8 attacks at strength user AP -3, damage 3. Really quite a big threat there just for 100 points. Though the Crushing Claws give you strength +4, so strength 10, AP -3, and damage d3 +3. Certainly going to have a lot more punch against heavy targets that you won't be wounding on 5s. The ranged options are 10 points each. You can't combine both Venom Cannons or Stranglethorn Cannons or double up on those, but you still have the Death Spitters with Slimer Maggots, they're an extra AP -1, Devourers with the Brain Leech Worms, they're 12 shots at strength 6, AP 0. Heavy Venom Cannons are up to strength 9, AP -3, damage 4, and you get a big 3 shots out of them. That seems like really quite a decent deal for 10 points extra. And the Stranglethorn Cannon is d3 +3 shots at a very generalist profile of strength 8, AP -2, and damage 2. Otherwise, there's still a crazy ton of options. On the tail, for 5 points, you can take a Mace or a Thresher Scythe. Each of them give you a small amount more damage in combat. For the head option, you can either take an Acid Maw for 5 points, which I think is not going to be worth it, a Bioplasma Attack, which is a 12-inch assault d3, strength 6, AP -3, damage 1 shot, or Enhanced Senses for 10 points, which I think would be worth it on a shooty Carnifex, giving it a ballistic skill of 3+. Tusks for 5 points gain it the hardened chitin, which will make it quite good for that mortal wound stratagem. And on the carapace it can take spine bangs for a close range assault 5, strength 5, AP nothing shot, or spore cysts for a fairly princely 15 points, though it does give you light cover at range, which works really nicely with this Carnifex's 2+ save now. Finally, as if that weren't enough, any of them can also take toxin sacks for auto wounds on 6s, adrenal glands for the extra strength and move for 10 points, or chitin thorns for 5 points, which make their AP better in melee by -1. Loads and loads and loads of options there. You can still easily make some Dakafexes with 24 strength 6 shots coming out of them, or suit them up for melee, maybe with a set of crushing claws and one set of scything talons. Other than the standard Carnifex, you also have their 2 variants as well. The Screamer Killers cost 115 points, they get some extra attacks, so 10 attacks at strength 6 and damage 3. A decently better Bioplasmic Scream at strength 8, d6 shots and AP -4, better movement at 10 inches, and they're also terrifying as well. Each model they kill causes an extra leadership -1, so could scare a few more enemies off the board. For a cheap general purpose Carnifex, they do seem quite good to me. I feel like the amount of kit that you get out of them is better than the 115 points would suggest. Finally, you have the Thornbacks, who get a couple of extra rules to help them out at range. Their ranged attacks get AP -1 better on 6s to wound, and they get to ignore light cover as well. They've got that Chitin Thorns upgrade included for free, so their AP is always -1 better, but they do have fairly limited options to play with, either Scything Talons or a Stranglethorn Cannon, coupled with either Death Spitters or Devourers in the other slots. I guess maybe with a Stranglethorn Cannon and one of the other guns, it could be quite a good general purpose shooting Carnifex, and then maybe buy them some enhanced senses. Overall, just a crazy amount of Carnifex flexibility here. You can really equip them how you like to, and I think the -1 damage and 2+ armor will do a decent job of making them more competitive. Next up we have the Tyranid Flyers, the Harpy and the Hive Crone. The Harpy's 160 points, up from 155. Both of these Tyranid Flyers were kind of in the weird space of being flyers but not technically aircraft. They now very much are proper aircraft, but are quite manoeuvrable ones, and they can pivot twice, or go into hollow mode for a 15-inch move instead. Statline wise, the Harpy now moves 40 inches, hits on 3s, gain toughness 7 and 13 wounds, 4 attacks, and a saving throw of 3+ from 4+. We've already mentioned the Heavy Venom Cannon and the Stranglethorn Cannon. They've both been improved, and the Stinger Salvos go to 8 shots as well, much like the Tyrannifex. Finally for the Harpy, it does get a bomb attack as well. Fairly typical for how a lot of bomber rules work in 9th edition, 1d6 per enemy model up to a maximum of 10, or 6 for a vehicle, roll the dice, and on a 4+ they take mortal wounds. Alternatively, if you've got nothing to bomb, you can spawn 3 spore mines over somewhere that you flew over, somewhere that's greater than 6 inches from an enemy unit. Overall, it certainly seems enormously improved. I do find it kind of hard to weigh up against all the other Tyranids though, with their massively improved stat lines as well. It certainly does a fair amount of damage between the bombs and the shooting, but flyers aren't going to help you out with objectives very much. The Hive Crone's 150 points, down from 155. In general, it's got really quite a lot of similar changes to the Harpy between the aircraft, Stinger Salvos and statline. The most interesting changes are maybe to the Dual Cannon and Tentaclids. The Dual Cannon is 18-inch range, 2d6 auto hits at strength 6, AP -2, damage 1, a fairly general purpose flamer there, and the Tentaclid missiles now are assault 4 attack rather than just 1 use shots, strength 7, AP -3, damage 2, they wound vehicles on a 4+ all the time, and a damage 4 against aircraft. The Crone's really good against anything that can fly, as it just gets +1 to hit against it natively, and it's a tiny bit better in melee compared with the Harpy. It gets Horned Chitin, and it gets a single spur attack, which hits at the much improved profile of strength +3, AP -4, and damage 3. Both of them seem to have their merits, to be honest. Maybe the Harpy's a little bit better against hard targets if you take the Venom Cannon. The Hive Crone does have its quite nice melee advantage though. Moving on, we come to the Tyrannocyte and the Spore Assist. Tyrannocyte being the drop pod transport for Tyranids, and now it really does function like a drop pod, as it allows you to set up in the first battle round regardless of mission rules. Potentially that's 100 points for deep striking one Tyranid unit of your choice, 20 models or 1 monster up to 16 wounds. Now infantry models that are greater than 1 wound take up 3 spaces. The stat line's strength and toughness 7 now, and it's 15 wounds, so it really will be a big pain to shift once it's down, and the Death Spitters, Venom Cannons and Barbed Stranglers have all been fairly decently improved as well. It'll cost you 50 points extra if you want to take all the Venom Cannons, admittedly the thing does hit on 5s, or 25 points if you want to deck it out with Barbed Stranglers. If you engage in melee, it gets 6 attacks at strength 7 AP-2 damage 2 with its Flensing Whips. Again though, they hit on 5s, so they're only going to do so much. Basically most of this thing's value is going to be in delivering the unit, and then it's just going to be a massive annoyance after that. If you're forcing your opponent to plow through this thing, then they're hopefully not shooting more valuable monsters. Perhaps some of the new monster profiles might warrant delivery like this, maybe things like the Toxicrin or Haruspex perhaps. The Spore Assist is the Tyranid Fortification, 95 points now, down from 115. It's actually got fewer wounds than it had before, down to 10 from 12, though otherwise gets more attacks than the Flensing Whips, and the similar gun profiles as above. Its Seed Spore Mines is now a movement fade action, that gives it 6 mines or 1 Mucilid, so it should be chucking out a fair amount of mines each turn. Maybe not really the toughest or hardest to deal with, but if it does keep on farming out those Spore Mines, it could be kind of irritating. It still also has that power as well for relaying synapse abilities. If you have a synapse unit within 12 inches, then this thing becomes synapse as well. Still maybe seems kind of low priority to take compared with other things. Definitely an annoyance threat, but not really one I could see doing all that much. Finally, we get onto the HQ section, and we'll start out with the Hive Tyrants. Typically, people have been only ever really running the one with wings, but now it's a lot more of a choice. The foot one's 160 points, up from 155, and again it's seen a lot of the Tyranid monster stat line buffs, strength 7 now, toughness 8, a 2+ armor save, and also 5 attacks in melee. The buffs to the melee weapons and things like the heavy venom cannon we've largely seen on Carnifexes. One thing that we haven't seen is the monstrous bone sword, strength +3, so strength 10, AP-4 and damage 3, and it gets to reroll ones to hit with the lash whip. He still casts psychic powers, but he can also buff one unit with his Synaptic Link command ability. One core squad within Synaptic Link range gets to reroll hit rolls of 1. Quite nice that they can actually command the swarms now. Otherwise he has Horned Chitin and can take adrenal glands and toxin sacs for those points. The Winged Tyrant has now been split off into its own different datasheet, and I'd say it looks like it could be one of the losers of the Codex really. It didn't really get any significant buffs like the other monsters. The only things it got were strength 7, a ballistic skill of 2+, and attacks 5. It doesn't get the toughness 8 or 2+ save. Because the wings replace one of the weapon slots, it now only gets a single set of main weapons. So if you're taking something like a venom cannon or some sardine talons, you're not going to be able to take the other options. As a small compensation though, you do get a couple of weak attacks from the tyrant talons, strength user AP-3 and damage 1. It gets a prehensile pincer tail included for free, that allows you to reroll one hit or wound roll, which would help out with bone swords and things. And if you do choose to deep strike it, then it automatically gets to reroll charges. Still really threatening with its absolutely massive movement of 16 inches. I feel like the melee option is going to be a lot more tempting on this guy. The main value being delivering all of its melee into combat very quickly, of course while doing psychic and commanding things. While we're on Hive Tyrants, the Swarm Lord himself is 220 points, down from 240. Kind of a mixed bag for him. He's lost his absolutely crazy double move ability, but he's gained an absolute massive amount of melee power. He's a lot tougher, and he's got another couple of really useful command abilities instead. He gets toughness 8, 13 wounds, and a 2+ save, and also has an absolute whopping 9 attacks with those bone sabers, striking at strength 9, AP-4 and damage 3. For his command abilities, he can broadcast through Synaptic Link for one core unit to reroll all hit rolls, the only source of innate Chapter Master rerolls in this codex, and he can also make one core unit within the link range gain Obsec or counters +1 model if it already has it. Could be nice for something like Carnifexes maybe. In melee, he no longer has his 3+ invul save. His blade parry rule now allows you to count one damage attack as 0 each time he fails a save in the fight phase, so that should be one very powerful attack gone per turn. Overall, I think he's still very nasty, just maybe no longer the linchpin which almost all Tyranid lists are built around, a bit more of a normal commander. Speaking of which, one thing that I was slightly surprised at was that he didn't get the Supreme Commander keyword. He did seem like a really obvious pick for it. The Broodlord's changed a bit. He's 120 points down from 125, and really the biggest deal for him is that he can forward deploy as well, potentially positioning an absolutely enormous psychic and melee threat in the midfield, just where he can get his hands on enemy units. Otherwise, most of his other changes aren't enormously major. He's lost a wound down to 6 from 7, gained a 4+ invul save from 5. The talons are flat 2 damage now, and they no longer give any extra damage on 6s, though still give extra AP. And like the Gene Stealers, he has lost advance and charge. For commanding the swarms though, he has got one synaptic link ability, one core unit gets extra AP in melee on 6s to wound, maybe a bit less relevant on Gene Stealers as their AP is already quite good, could be a bit better on the lesser swarms perhaps. Moving on, we come to the Neurothrope, 100 points up from 95. This one's the character Zoanthrope. It's gained toughness and strength 5 like its kin, 6 wounds, and unlike the other Zoanthropes, it does retain its 3+ invul save, so it's actually going to be properly annoying to shift for that points cost. If it deals psychic mortal wounds, it'll heal nearby Neurothropes or Zoanthropes at less than 12 inches up to 3 wounds per phase, has gained a +1 to cast any psychic powers just at base, and it also has a Synaptic Link command phase ability. One Tyranid Psycho within Synaptic Link range gets to roll 3d6 when casting and choose which 2 to keep. I believe that could target himself as well if he wanted to. Between that and +1 to cast, that should be some fantastically reliable spells. The Tyranid Prime is 85 points up from 75, it gained a ballistic skill 2+, and other than that it's just largely the same story as the Warriors. Every single bit of kit got buffed in one way or other. I think the Bone Swords with their damage 2 and strength 7 will be particularly relevant for the Prime. He's actually going to be somewhat decent in melee now. His Alpha Warrior ability is his Synaptic Link command thing. One core unit within link range gets reroll 1s to wound. It appears that he's become the lieutenant of the Tyranid forces. I think he's going to be really popular, fairly cheap, reasonably fighty in melee. The Alpha Warrior thing is pretty handy, and it's got that really nice Synaptic Imperative, amping up your shooting. The Trigon Prime is kind of unexpectedly moved to the HQ slot, 175 points, and kind of very similar to the profile of the regular Trigon, costing 30 points more. And for the privilege, you get the character keyword, Synapse, Shadow in the Warp, and a short-ranged bioelectric pulse attack, 12-inch range, assault 8, strength 5, AP -2, and damage 1. Again, it has a command phase ability. The Bio Impulse Synaptic Link targets one core unit, and they get +1 to advance and charge. Again, I guess that's handy enough if you do know that one unit's going to be trying to make a long charge later in the turn. I think the Tervigon's another unit that was very underwhelming that they've made interesting. 215 points up from 180. Again, big stat line buffs, hits on 3s, 17 wounds from 14, and a 2+ armor save. Its melee is really quite a lot more dangerous, hitting on 3s and getting 4 attacks rather than 3 are both good things. And you've got the choice of either taking Scything Talons, which will allow you to either choose between double attacks at damage 2 or strength 10 attacks at AP -4 and damage 2d3, or instead you can take the Crushing Claws, just strength 14, AP -5, damage d3 +3 might. The Stinger Salvo is a bit better again, but really the main reason that you want to bring the Tervigon is to spawn Termagants everywhere. It now only gets to replenish 2d6 Termagants into a damaged unit, but far more interestingly, once per game you can spawn one entirely fresh squad of Termagants with Flesh Borers, you get 10 models set up, and now this squad doesn't cost you any reinforcement points at all. You basically got 10 7-point Termagants preloaded into this bug. I feel like it makes it quite a good deal between the points cost and the stats it has, plus the fact that it also does psychic powers and some melee. Finally, it's gained another couple of handy special rules. Brood Progenitor is that command phase Synaptic Link ability. A Termagant's unit gets +1 to hit, very nice with those Flesh Borers. And also, it can be very hard to target the Tervigon as well now. If there's a unit of Termagants within 1 inches of it, then it can't be shot by ranged attacks. I think that's quite a nice touch, as it means that you won't just be able to pick off this thing immediately if you do bring just one of them along with a horde. Finally, we've got Old One-Eye, 220 points worth of character Carnifex. He's picked up a fair few of the changes that the others have. He's got strength 7 and a 2+ armor save now, plus -1 damage for a bit more toughness. His melee profile has maybe had a small side grade, he hits on 3s and he gets 6 attacks. His claws really are quite fearsome though. They'll be hitting at strength 11, AP -3, and a big damage d6 +2. Then backing that up with an extra 2 attacks at Scything Talons at damage 2, and a further 3 attacks at strength 4, AP -1 from his Thresher Scythe. His chitin thorns will make his AP better on his melee by AP -1 throughout. He gets an extra D3+1 attacks if he charges in, and he can make one Carnifex unit within 9 inches get +1 to hit, which I believe could be him as well. Quite nice to have the option of a threat that massive that you can screen behind character protection. I feel like he could be quite problematic lurching out behind the back of another monstrous creature or something that your opponent's forced to target before dealing with him. So with that done, that brings us to the end of our datasheet section of the Codex, and our end of the review in general. Overall, I think it's certainly feeling like another 9th edition Codex. Crazy stat creep on just about every second unit. All of the monsters are going to be feeling far meatier than they were before, a lot more threatening, and nowhere near as easy to remove from the table. The same with a lot of the medium-sized Tyranids like the Warriors and Raveners. I feel like Tervigons with Hordes could be quite fun, but I'm kind of surprised at just how much these standard Tyranid Hordes cost. 7 or 8 points for a toughness 3 model with a 5 or 6 plus save just generally isn't all that impressive, even if they do hit a fair bit harder. In any case, I'm sure that the Codex will be fairly monstrously strong. It looks like they're going to be another Codex that might be facing up to the new normal that is Tau, Custodes and Eldar, and particularly so if the Hive Fleet Leviathan supplement and Crusher Stampede do remain fully game legal. It's going to be good fun having a look at what people make of the new Codex, how they put the new units into action in some army lists. I'm sure I'll be making a fair few more Tyranid videos going over the book over the next few days and weeks. I guess feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see any of that. It'll be fun to make a few unit reviews. I'm sure we'll have a tier list and some Hive Fleet discussion somewhere down the line as well. Let me know your thoughts on the book then. Feel free to subscribe to the channel. And finally, if you have enjoyed the review, I would just like to mention the channel's Patreon page, which is the thing that allows me to keep on making really big videos like this and quite so regularly. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, getting to vote on what sort of videos come next, and also entry to the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.